Carl died and Ellie survived? What if that iconic scene, which many consider to be the best thing in Up, was flipped on its head and our good buddy Carl was the one in the hospital bed? Would Ellie end up in a similar slump of sadness afterwards, or would she be able to move on and give those bright new horizons a high five? What kind of new adventures would be worth having after death has parted them? What would become of their iconic little house? How about characters like Russel, Doug, Kevin, and Charles Muntz? Would things in general start looking up or down? Well, it's been a while since I've watched the adventures of Geriatric Jones and Short and Round, but I'm eager to see what would happen if Ellie was behind the wheel of the ship and what sort of insane adventures she'd steer us straight into. My name is Dr. Box, and I shall be your guide through this plane of existence in the Animation Multiverse. Going up! Okay, so before we jump into assumptions, it's probably best if I summarize the relationship between our two lovebirds first. And since you guys liked my recap song from last time, I'm gonna do another one. Maestro! So yeah, basically the first 10 minutes of this masterpiece will remain untouched. Carl and Ellie still meet as kids, they still spend their lovely montage life together, Carl still rams his nuts into a stump. Maybe he's the reason they couldn't have kids. But in my version, instead of Ellie taking the fall on the day of their picnic, it'll be Carl that does so instead. The two of them actually walk up the hill together, hand in hand, and make it to the top. But while the two of them are looking at clouds before their meal, mirroring an experience in their younger years just like the original, Ellie looks over to Carl, who starts coughing profusely. He's immediately rushed to the hospital, Ellie stays by his bedside for as long as she can, and Carl even reveals to her that he insisted on wearing his little grape soda button even on his hospital gown. But unfortunately, this moment pretty much caps off Carl Fredricksen's life. He passes away, but unlike Ellie, who was presumably buried, Carl's dying wish is actually that he gets cremated. It's not a stretch to say that Ellie was his entire world for most of his life, so I imagine that he'd want to be as close to her as possible, even in death, and his urn is placed right on the little adventure shelf that they had built so long ago. As far as the recovery process goes, I think it would be a little bit easier for Ellie than it was for Carl, and she definitely wouldn't grow into the same kind of person that he did. For one thing, Ellie is a very optimistic girl at heart, who tries to make the best of a bad situation. I mean, if you look at that mailbox scene in their montage, when Carl accidentally leaves a paint print on it, he's like, "Oh no, I'm sorry, I didn't mean to." But Ellie's like, "Nah, it's fine, I'll put mine on there too." She'd still be sad, obviously, and that is a sadness that I doubt will ever go away, but she seems like the kind of person that would at least realize that there are other things in her life worth living for and being happy about, as opposed to Carl, who pretty much saw Ellie as his happiness. On top of that, this one shot of Ellie's family shows just how big, close, and loving they are compared to Carl's family, which is full of dull, robotic, distant old salts. Though I do have to ask, who's the freaking idiot who brought a 12 gauge into the church? Cletus, when I said shotgun wedding, this wasn't what I meant! Anyway, because Ellie's family seems so tightly knit, I think it's safe to assume that when they caught wind of Carl's passing, they would do everything they could to support her. Visits, phone calls, get-togethers, everything to make her feel loved. Heck, you know that scene at the end of the montage when Carl has to walk to his house alone after the wake? Well, if Ellie was in that position, I guarantee you that at least one or two family members would stay with her until she was ready and personally walk her home. Trust me, I speak from experience here. A close family can really soften the blow of recovery when someone you love passes, and I'm glad that Ellie would have that at her time of need. After the fact, instead of becoming a bitter, grumpy old grouch like Carl was after his loss, I imagine that Ellie would be more like the town grandma. Very sweet, very welcoming, says good morning or hello to anyone who comes her way, maybe bakes stuff for the locals, and even participates in community activities. Cause she may be old, but she's still got a spring in her step. However, while she does have other things to be happy about in her life, she never stops missing Carl. And while she does seem sunny on the surface, she still has her moments of weakness. Crying in private, flipping through her adventure book of memories, and just wishing that he could be there with her. Eventually, the 1-year anniversary of Carl's passing comes around, and this is obviously when Ellie is at her most vulnerable. This is one day that she decides to spend mostly inside for obvious reasons. Heck, she barely eats or drinks anything throughout the day just because she's so upset. Eventually, she decides that she's gotta have something, at least for dinner. So she opens up the fridge door, and what do we see but the very picnic basket that Carl had brought with him on the day he was rushed to the hospital. And in the same way that Carl refuses to look further into Ellie's adventure book, she refuses to empty out that basket. It'd just be too painful. However, being more of an optimist than Carl was, she does think to herself that Carl would not want this. He'd want her to be happy on this day, even if he wasn't there with her. He'd want her to smile that beautiful smile that he loves so much. So while she doesn't feel like digging through the whole basket, she at least decides to grab that bottle of... I think that's soda? Or maybe sparkling water? It can't be wine, since wine never gets bottle capped. Whatever. The point is that Ellie decides to grab that bottle of whatever it is and actually toast to Carl's memory before the day is up. But once she grabs the bottle, she slips and the entire basket falls over, spilling its contents onto the floor, including the plane tickets that Carl had bought for her so long ago. Ellie realizes that Carl was planning to surprise her with this special trip all along, something that they had dreamed about for the longest time, but because of what happened, he never got to go. And while this does unleash a few tears upon the now expired tickets, it also unleashes a spark inside her. The two of them have wanted to travel for ages, with the only thing holding them back being finances and unfortunate incidents. But now that she's retired and getting some decent benefits from that, this is the perfect time to finally fulfill that dream. It's what her husband clearly wanted. It's something they both wanted once upon a time. Adventure is still out there, they just gotta find it. And Ellie, being the kind of girl that she is gonna take things to the nth degree. She's not just gonna go to Paradise Falls. Oh no. She's gonna go see everything. And so begins a lifelong expedition where Ellie vows to see all kinds of habitats, locales, flora, and fauna, exploring this beautiful world in her husband's memory. She starts off with more local spots, at least trying to stay within North America, and travels from state to state drinking in the unique locations she comes across, but always returning to her cozy home every time she's done. In fact, a few of these trips end up turning into full-on discoveries. Being an expert on all things avian, aka birds, Ellie actually discovers a few new species while on her journeys. I'm not saying that she discovers the next Kevin or anything.
At least not yet.
But she does find a few feathered friends with subtle differences that she notices. Remember, there are tons of things that could constitute a new bird species, from big things like body shape and color to small things like the shape of their beak. Ellie feels that it would be wrong if she didn't share these new discoveries with others, since a lot of people would probably be interested in them. So she actually donates her findings to various museums and scientific organizations while remaining anonymous, because while she's happy to share her discoveries, she doesn't want any of the fame or money that comes with it. Because at the end of the day, the whole purpose of this journey of hers is to be a quiet, simple walk through life while taking in the new sights and sounds, just like her husband and her always wanted to do. Eventually, however, Ellie's anonymous exploits catch the ear of the National Explorer Society, the same group that Charles Muntz was once a part of in his heyday that are still going strong today due to various scientific breakthroughs. They start noticing all of these anonymous donations and start to suspect that something is up. While a lot of people make monetary donations to science on the regular, they've never received this many reports of new species being discovered this quickly. They suspect that it might all be coming from the same group or even the same person, so they hire some kind of private investigators or detectives to try and track down who's making all these discoveries. Eventually, their evidence leads them to Ellie, and once they finally confront her, they are incredibly grateful for all the work she's done to further the world's knowledge of ornithology. She must be a very gifted scientist. And Ellie cutely proclaims, "Oh, I'm not a scientist, I just really like birds." On that very day, the Explorer Society makes an offer to her. They say that if she's willing to go to more worldwide locations with that sharp wit and keen eye of hers and find more unique species, they will personally fund her expeditions, including food, supplies, and transportation. They'd even be willing to grant her access to numerous research materials that could expand her knowledge of nature and help her discover species of various other creatures besides just birds. Ellie is very conflicted about all this. I mean, she's wanted to be a real adventurer ever since childhood. Big airships, grand explorations, unknown danger around every corner. This is practically a dream come true. But then she also thinks that this would kind of spit in the face of the whole reason she went exploring in the first place. She only made the donations because she thought it would make people happy. However, this may be the only opportunity she'll ever have to explore the entire globe, no expenses paid, and see all the wonderful things that she knew her husband would have wanted her to see. So she accepts, but only on 3 conditions. Number 1, her mode of transport would be an airship, just like her and Carl's old childhood hero. Number 2, her future discoveries will still remain anonymous to everyone except the society's higher-ups. Heck, she doesn't even want her picture on that wall of fame. And finally, if possible, she would like her cozy little house to be fashioned into the airship's cockpit, the base of operations, the main command center, the place where she's going to spend the majority of her time while on the ship. This way she'll feel like she's always home, and she'll continue to be closer to Carl. The higher-ups find this kinda unconventional, especially since airships are kinda phased out by this point, but they agree to it anyway. So Ellie gets her ship. I don't know, maybe she calls it like Paradise Rising or the SS Fredricksen, I don't know. But she's fully stocked for the journey, and off she goes! She spends the next few years trekking the globe and making various donations to the society, all while her home and her husband remain close by and never leave her side. Eventually though, she does start to feel the years catch up with her, and she realizes that she clearly does not have a lot of time left. So she decides to make one last fateful trip. She circumnavigates the Earth one final time, but this time, at every location she visited, she spreads a tiny bit of Carl's ashes across the landscape. Bit by bit, place by place she goes, until only a small bit of his remains remain. When this happens, she steers the airship to the one spot that meant the most to both of them since the beginning, Paradise Falls. She steps out of the cockpit and onto the water-soaked rocks of South America, urn in hand. Then with a final flick of her wrist, she tosses half of the remaining ashes across the falls, but keeps the other half for herself, so at least some part of Carl is always with her. From this point on, in her eyes, not only is Carl now with her forever as was his dying wish, but no matter where anyone goes on this beautiful planet Earth, Carl will be there too. This man that made her life so comfortable, so heavenly, so truly magical, is now everywhere you look. She traveled the world in his memory and shared a little bit of him with everyone upon it. And now not only was Carl a big part of her world, but he can now be a part of everyone's world and the world as a whole. Now the ending could happen in one of two ways. Maybe she decides to retire to Paradise Falls after the fact. She'd call up the Explorer Society and tell them that she might not be making it back this time. She'd even give them her blessing to finally reveal her name to the public, since she's basically done with her adventure. And they don't just unveil her name, they actually open up a dedicated wing to her discoveries in multiple museums across the globe. Ellie Fredricksen, the Airborne Adventurer, or something like that. Then she could just spend the rest of her days in peace and tranquility, knowing that she not only accomplished a goal that her and her husband had set forth long ago, but now the entire world is blessed by the remains of a kind and caring man. Or maybe she decides to go back to her hometown on the airship. Not her original home spot, I imagine she probably sold that land to a tycoon a while ago since she didn't really need it anymore. Then she could at least spend her final days with her family and neighborhood friends. The former's really thematic, but the latter's really wholesome, so I'd be fine with either one. Alrighty, that covers everything about our leading lady, but there are still a few loose ends left to tackle. You know what I'm talking about, side characters. There aren't as many as in Toy Story, but there are a couple, so let's see what kind of adventures they'd be up to in this timeline. Charles Muntz! Honestly, shouldn't even be alive in this movie. I mean, he's like what, in his late 20s, early 30s when Carl's like 10? Carl's almost 80, so this guy should be like 100 at this point. He should have pushed up daisies long ago and became food for his dogs. But if we go by the film's logic, he'd definitely still be alive while Ellie was out adventuring. And the fact that Ellie would specialize in ornithology could actually be a source of conflict for these two aging adventurers. Imagine if instead of Carl happening upon Kevin by accident due to Russell eating the worst food for a hiker, seriously kid, eat a granola bar or something. Ellie actually discovers Kevin of her own accord as she was searching around the Paradise Falls area one day. She also figures out about Kevin's gender, motherhood status, and chocolate affinity after taking some time to observe her closely, with Kevin's blessing of course. Heck, she even vows to get Kevin on the protected species list so that her and her babies can flourish without harm from poachers. But speaking of poachers, Muntz's dogs are on the prowl, and they discover that another adventurer in an airship is trying to poach their master's prey. Inevitably, when they run into each other, there'd be some major conflict of interest going on, with Muntz only caring about fame and recognition, and Ellie caring more about conservation and protection. Ellie would probably try to escape from Muntz with Kevin in tow, since she'd obviously be safer with her than in Muntz's clutches. Muntz would chase them both down in his own airship, we'd get a little Zeppelin-on-Zeppelin fighting action, and just like in the original, Muntz's one-track mind and hot-headed nature does lead to his downfall in one way or another. Maybe a full-on Hindenburg explosion, maybe a fatal crash, maybe a simple fall from grace, but yeah, more than likely he wouldn't survive his encounter with Ellie, who takes things more calmly and rationally than he would. In the end, she succeeds in making Kevin a protected species, and her babies will be able to grow up without fear thanks to her help. It's similar to how Carl and Russell saved her during their little adventure, just with the added bonus of securing their future safety in the name of the law. Oh, and speaking of Russell, here's a diversion that starts off nice, but then gets kinda depressing the more you think about it. With Ellie being so well known and well loved around the neighborhood since she's way more outgoing than Carl ever was, I imagine that Russell would definitely turn to her for the assisting the elderly badge as well. You know, when she's not out and about on an adventure. But unlike Carl, who initially turned him down and lied to him about the snipe,
I found the snipe!
Sniping's a good job, mate.
Ellie would probably just let him help her outright without any fuss. Crossing the street, crossing the yard, crossing the porch, crossing the Delaware, crossing the T's and dotting the I's, whatever they decide to do, Ellie would be more than happy to help this boy get his badge. Anyway, Ellie signs off on his badge and he goes about his day. Seems really cute at first. Until you realize that Russell never got Carl as his surrogate father figure at the end of the movie. So in this timeline, he still doesn't really have a male parent in his life, and he also has no one to pin his badge on him at the big ceremony. So it's great he got the badge, but that's the only really great thing that happens in this scenario. Sorry, little buddy. Looks like it's just gonna be you and your mom for a while. Squirrel! Anyway, let's move on. And lastly, we have the definitive Disney best boy. My initial thought was that no Carl plus no Russell equals no Doug character arc, and thus no happy ending for the doggos. But like I said before, with Ellie having a big lean towards studying birds, it's totally possible for her and Muntz to have some kind of clash of ideals if they ever run into each other. Especially if Ellie's able to find and tame this mythical beast on her first try, something that this poor sod's been trying to do for years. Or I guess in his case, months. So if this clash of adventurers does end up happening and Charles Muntz becomes Charlie Down, it's totally possible for Ellie to actually take the doggos under her wing and bring them back to society. I imagine they wouldn't exactly trust her at first, especially if she's partially responsible for killing their master, but thanks to the fact that she's been studying animals all her life for research purposes, she knows all kinds of techniques to quell the dog's suspicions and make them respect her, including all the best places for pets and scratches. Doug is the first one to trust her, as you would expect, and even vouches for her, saying, "I know a good human when I see and smell them, and I get a very good feeling from this human right here. She makes me feel good and warm and happy when I am around her. I think we should trust her." All the dogs ask to be scratched and petted next, and after a while, Ellie's got an army of loyal dogs at her disposal. Then she could either send them to good homes while on her journeys, or keep some of them as her companions. Not quite as satisfying as Doug becoming the new alpha like in the first movie, but still pretty cute. It's also possible for Doug to come across Ellie during her little Kevin expedition, just like he did with Carl, but considering that he was specifically sent to a spot where Kevin would never be, a literal fool's errand as stated by Alpha, the chance of the two of them meeting by coincidence is pretty unlikely. So I'm just gonna say that her and the dog start off as total strangers, and she gradually builds their trust over time, with Doug being the first one to attach to her. Either way, at least Doug and the doggos are guaranteed some kind of happy ending. If there's anything I want most out of this AU, happy puppers would definitely be at the top of the list. So yeah, aside from some sad side character fates, this sounds like a pretty high-flying story to me. It's got a lot of great emotional beats like the original, as well as a more grand-scale sense of adventure and a bubbly protagonist. Definitely sounds like the kind of movie I'd be up for, but overall, what do you guys think? What do you think would happen if the Fredricksen fatalities were swapped? And what did you think of my ideas? Leave your thoughts in the comments below. Thanks for tuning in, everybody, and I hope to see you all real soon.